Welcome, everybody. This is our second in our series on practice in Housing First, where we're particularly looking at issues in the delivery of Housing First, issues that arise for people working in Housing First, people managing Housing First, people participating in Housing First. And we're really excited today because we have three people who are here to share their experience with peer work from different perspectives and from different countries. So that makes it even more enriching for all of us. The Housing First Europe Hub is a network of organizations, NGOs, services that deliver Housing First, foundations, cities, housing providers, some government ministries, and researchers who have come together to promote and support the scaling up of Housing First. So to really look at how do we make systems shift so Housing First becomes the first and foremost approach to tackling homelessness in any given city or country across Europe. And we've been running these webinars. This is our second one in practice, but we've been doing webinars for almost a year now. I guess we're coming up on sort of 8 months since the pandemic took hold. And as we were just saying earlier, it's too bad that we can't all meet in person, but we've really appreciated this opportunity to be able to bring people together online to talk about relevant issues, to create a forum for discussion, and to give an opportunity for people to participate from across Europe and even from across the world. We have people from Canada for sure this morning, we've seen. So I would just make one last appeal to people who are joining us to please let us know where you're from. Just pop your name and where you're from into the chat so that we know who's there. And I'm gonna finish up my introduction again. My name is Samara Jones. I'm one of the coordinators of the Housing First Europe Hub. I'm based in Brussels in my living room. And I will hand over the official duties now to Niall. Thanks very much, and looking forward to—
Thank you, Samara. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. You're welcome to the second installment of our webinar program from the Housing First Good Practice group. We are looking today at the peer working in Housing First. And I suppose we all know that peer workers can play a crucial role in helping Housing First teams provide treatment and support services in a manner that's grounded in the recovery principles. We also know that when working with individuals who experience long periods of homelessness, experience has shown that often it's the peer worker who can relate best to the client's experience. And this understanding that's demonstrated is able to earn the trust in the client. And so today we're going to be looking at how this works in practice and how it benefits the participants and the organisations that work with them. And we've three speakers today representing Scotland, Finland and France, and they're going to share their experience of peer work and how it works, particularly in their country, in their environment and in their context. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Liz. Liz Litter is Service Manager with the Housing First Consortium in Glasgow, and she's worked in the homeless sector for 20 years, 18 of which have been with Third Sector in Glasgow. She has been a keen passion of hers has been Housing First since 2013 when she joined Turning Point in Scotland. And she's proud to be part of developing of the pioneering Housing First service in Glasgow and has been an active member of the Housing First Europe since its inception. So currently Liz manages the Housing First Consortium Glasgow, which is part of the Pathfinder project in Scotland. So if I can hand over to Liz, I think she's going to share her presentation on screen and talk through it. So thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you, Niall. Right. Well, hello, everybody. As Niall said, my name is Liz. I'm the service manager just now at the Housing First Consortium in Glasgow. I did join Turning Point in 2013 and was lucky enough just to come in at the end of the Housing First pilot there. That's been 10 years. I still manage that service as well, although it's a much smaller service than what we have just now. So I'm just going to take you through my presentation, which is based on managing peers in Housing First, for those of you that have got an interest from that point of view. As we said, it was the peer support workers were developed in 2010, and we decided at that point that we wanted peer staff to be a key element of the staff team. So one of the important things for us really was that peer workers were paid. employees and not just volunteers. And that was the difference we wanted to make, because up until then there had been a lot of peers around in social care, but it was mainly in a voluntary capacity. So we were one of the first to take on, as they were just getting paid the same money as a support worker. The recruitment and the induction, etc., was based in the same way, although we were looking obviously for a different life experience. Peers had to have a lived experience of their own of homelessness and or addictions. We have now broadened that to include mental health, criminal justice, etc. But at the time it was homelessness and addictions. So as a manager, I would say you need to have an awareness that for peers, they may face additional stress and pressure, and particularly if this is their first employment. And we discovered that quite a few of the peers that we were interviewing and have taken on through the years, it was their first employment. So things are very difficult for them. You know, sometimes this was individuals maybe age, I don't know, age 30 plus, 40, whatever. But for them, one of the things you have to consider is it's like someone who's leaving school at 18 and starting their first job. And it's the same for the peer worker, even though they may be 35 or 40. So it's something really as a manager that you have to keep in mind. This obviously doesn't apply to all peers, but it will apply to some. We do discuss at the interview about, you know, what the job entails. Obviously, we want to know about their own lived experience and also how they have dealt with their recovery journey. Excuse me. One of the things we really need to highlight is that many housing first service users are still actively using substances. You know, I would say that was almost 100% of service users, whether that be alcohol or other drugs, when coming into housing first, they still are actively using. So we highlight that to peer workers because that may be something they've not considered, and it could be something that could perhaps cause some difficulty. Because we are an outreach service, obviously staff meet service users in their own environment. Once they have a tenancy, they meet them in their own home. Not all the time, they can meet out with as well, but generally the support is carried out within the home. Apart from now with the pandemic, obviously, but however, we'll forget about the pandemic. It does expose staff to viewing drug paraphernalia or alcohol. Sometimes even the substances themselves that are lying around, although service users are always asked to ensure that any paraphernalia, any drugs are hidden away for when the worker is in the home. Sometimes that doesn't quite happen the way it should. So it may well be that you have stuff like that lying around. And it's really important to explore with the potential peer about how they might feel about this, because there is a risk of triggers for some people. I have had a few peer workers who have felt that this was something they would deal with. You know, they'd been in recovery for a number of years and felt that it wouldn't be an issue for them. However, when actually working on the job, after a period of time, 3 or 4 months, discovered that it actually was something that they couldn't deal with. It was triggering too many memories and trauma really of past life. So those peers at that time in particular, we were still able to keep employing within Turning Point, but they went to another service then instead of Housing First, because it was something that was going to suit them better. So one of the absolute benefits of having the peer with lived experiences is the motivation that they have. They like to encourage clients to engage in addiction services and recovery groups. And using your own experiences as a motivator for service users is always a positive thing. Yeah, there are service users do see peer workers as a source of inspiration. That might sound a bit airy-fairy, but it is true. They are inspired by how someone has moved on from their previous lived experience. Another thing as a manager that you really need to have an understanding of is how the support needs of peers may diverge slightly from the usual support needs of other staff. That shouldn't be a problem, because as a manager, you should be able to do that, provide different support. Everybody in a team needs some sort of different level of support in different areas of their work. And peers are no different. And I think if you always keep that in mind, that your support and your development is focused on the individual, that way there's no inequality within your service either. And staff should all feel as if they're treated the same, but differently. And that should apply to every member of staff, not just peer workers. We do know through history, obviously, that stress and substance-related cues can be significant factors in relapse, which is why we're so careful to offer the support that we do. Peers can often put themselves under a lot of pressure by having unrealistic expectations of those that they're supporting. Another thing that can be significant for new peer workers are boundaries between the worker and the service user. Obviously, that applies to all of a staff team, because it's not only peers that this can happen to, but you may have additional issues for a peer worker where certain parts of that may apply to them because of the lived experience. We have had on several occasions peer workers who have attended a service user and discovered that this is someone that they used to sit with and use drugs with or drink with. And for some, that may have only been 3 years or so before. So you can imagine that would, I think, set off a whole myriad of different feelings and thoughts for somebody. So the peer worker needs to disclose this with you, and it can be managed. And in actual fact, it's for us, when it has happened, it has usually been positive, because the service user has seen who used to be their friend was now someone who, was holding down a job, had a different life, maybe, a new partner, sometimes children, their own home, and can look and think, God, 3 years ago, they were sitting with me in a corner somewhere and we were injecting heroin, and just look at how their life has changed. So it doesn't have to be a negative, it can be turned around and made a positive. I think as a team, as any team within Housing First, managers and the whole of the team, everybody, we can all benefit for the different perspective that peer support workers may have. An example would be, and we have been in several discussions where we may have spoken about a service user saying X, Y, and Z, and we didn't quite understand what they were talking about. But a peer worker would be able to explain that to us as a team, because they have spoken the same language and used the same verbal communication as the service user, know the street names of different drugs, different ways of mixing and concocting drugs that we might not always be aware of because we haven't been involved in that side of life. So it really is something that's worthwhile, and it's a great resource to have on your team as well. Peers would be, I say, although we have a mix of outcomes that we like to show within Housing First, and there are many hard outcomes. These are the ones that tick all the boxes, that you have to meet to make your local authority, your municipality, that keeps them happy. You need to tick this box and that box. Now, that can be done by peers, but more than that is that I would say they're good at meeting the softer outcomes. And I've included a quote there from Homeless Network England Fidelity Guidance. Of course, hard and soft outcomes are viewed with equal importance. But sometimes just getting somebody to go to an appointment, accompanying them to their GP, going to the supermarket, buying and budgeting for a week's shopping, I don't know, getting a new table lamp or something for the living room. These are things that aren't ticked on boxes, but they're the things that help build the relationships with the service user, and they're the things that probably give people more comfort. They're not interested, service users are not interested in that you should be able to tick your box. They're interested in improving their life, and that's what the peer worker can do. As an individual and someone who's managed peers for almost 8 years now, I really believe it's the most satisfying thing probably that I have done, just to see somebody flourish and grow and confidence and knowledge and skills has been absolutely amazing. And I have assisted several peers to move on to something else that might be more challenging, or, you know, up to a promoted position, sometimes into further education, into university. And it really is absolutely amazing. And yeah, obviously I feel a great satisfaction when we see service users succeeding even in small ways. But to see a peer worker doing that for me as a manager, I just, yeah, you can tell by what I'm saying. Yeah, I just find it absolutely amazing. And I have nothing but admiration for those who manage it. And even for those who try as well, because not everybody does make it, but even for those who have tried, it's heartwarming, I think is the word. So that's quite a short presentation, but obviously we've got times for questions and answers at the latter end, which I'm happy to participate in. So anything you have, just fire it into the chat, and Samara and Niall will be able to access that. These are just my contact details there. If there's anything, you know, if you want to email me any questions you have that you think about after the webinar. So on that note, I shall say thank you for listening.
Today I'm going to introduce Alison next. Alison is a clinical social worker and a peer aide at Unshez Soit the board. I hope I pronounced that correctly. If not, apologies. She is that's located in Paris, and she's worked there since 2013. She has also worked as a social worker, clinical social worker in the USA and in France as a therapeutic counsellor for patients who are at risk, and also in liaison with physicians and psychiatrists and psychologist admission evaluator in the hospital emergency services. In addition to her professional work, Alison has shared experience and expertise as a volunteer with the Clubhouse France and also with the American AIDS Society in Paris, in France. So she is participating in Housing First Initial European Hub training program, and that's also where she's getting some experience from. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Alison to give her presentation, and it's going to be a verbal presentation, so there's no PowerPoint in this one. So Alison, can I hand over to yourself?
Hi, I'm Alison. I'm a peer worker at Unshez Soit d'Abord, or Housing First Paris. And I've been there since the beginning in 2013. And Housing First France started in 2011 in Marseille, Toulouse, and Lille, and a year later in Paris in 2012. It was decided that as part of the experimental aspect of this project, that peer aides would be included in the multidisciplinary teams. In December 2016, after the experimental phase of Housing First ended in France and proved successful through statistics, it was decreed by the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health that peer aides must be a part of the multidisciplinary team when the program was adopted by the government as a model treatment for homeless people. The peer aide in Housing First shares his or her lived experience and recovery from substance abuse and/or psychiatric illnesses with the tenant. It is a way to create a special bond, trust, or relationship. By sharing his or her experience in recovery from substance abuse or psychiatric illnesses, the peer aide brings hope and empathy into the lives of the tenants. The peer aide's insight and special relationship with the tenant can also help the team in terms of understanding the tenant's struggles by sharing their experience with them. For example, their fear of hospitalization, their fear of medication, their fear of stopping using, and the consequences that go along with that. There's a whole host of things that I can share with the team that the tenant is experiencing and is resistant to initially. In Housing First Paris, we work in pairs. A peer aide might be paired up with a psychiatrist, social worker, nurse, or generalist. Their experience, the peer aide's experience, often helps the medical social team. And I think you addressed that, Liz, in terms of knowing substances, being able to see if a patient is maybe a little high or out of sorts, and so on. Often when shared, the experience of the peer aide helps the tenant share his own. Each peer aide develops his own style in terms of disclosure and carrying the message of recovery and hope that it is possible to reinsert oneself into society. Some peer aides disclose right away who they are, their role and lived experiences. That's what I did. I would introduce myself as a peer aide and sort of define my role as a peer aide to the tenants when I first met them. Others choose to disclose when it appears opportune. The peer aide accompanies the tenant on his or her own path and choices unconditionally, and often over time to psychiatric or substance abuse help with other members of the team, as well as comorbid health problems. But this takes time. The Housing First value of accepting the tenant and his or her choices unconditionally with harm reduction as the tool often leads to surprising results. We had one tenant who was very volatile at the beginning and had a hard time moving into his apartment. Once moved in, he moved out and back to the street, and then moved back into his apartment. His moods were very up and down. He was often difficult with the team. He refused to see some members of the team, but would see me, for example. One team member had to wait outside while I was with the tenant once. But as time passed and we spoke to him about some of his challenges, he agreed to see a psychiatrist. And we accompanied him the first few times. And then once we went to meet him at the psychiatrist, and he looked at us and he said, "What are you doing here? I'm an adult. I can do this alone." So that was sort of a success story. And he was sort of taking it into his own hands. And from then on, when he needed to be hospitalized, he would ask us, "I need to be hospitalized. I'm not doing well. Can you accompany me to the hospital?" And we would follow him from there. So that's sort of one of the example of the role of peer workers and the team working together to get help to the tenant. A tenant who initially refused any form of psychiatric treatment, in time with the help of the team and peer aides, may agree in his or her journey to accept help. The emergence of the peer aide in France initially ruffled many feathers in the medical social world. Nurses felt threatened that we would take their place, and some teams reluctantly accepted the peer workers, sort of setting them aside. At Housing First, my experience in Paris was a team that was prepared to receive a peer worker and open to what our role was. My experience as a peer aide, at that time, I did have to invent my role as I went along because it was just the beginning of the program, and I sort of I had no other examples to fall back on. But having been trained in the US as a clinical social worker and working in emergency rooms, hospitals, and clinics, I had some experience under my belt working with homeless. In addition, I had my own personal journey of 30 years on and off of substance abuse and a reluctant acceptance of my diagnosis as bipolar. I started off with a very privileged upbringing, but ended up shooting up heroin and crack and living with my dealer in what was sometimes a crack house. I ran the gamut before coming to Paris, experiencing the French psychiatric system, which was not easy to say the least, and not adapted to dual diagnosis. But I finally got sober and became stably emotionally 11 years ago. The peer aid is a fundamental part of the multidisciplinary team, but as they say, they're still defining their roles. A group of Housing First peer aides in France has created a space to discuss practices and to draft a job description of what qualities a peer aide should have. And they meet once a month and discuss their experiences. And one of their projects is to draft a description of the qualities a peer aide should have to work in the Housing First setting. The challenge that peer aides in France and at Housing First face is the lack of legal framework or statute. In the bureaucratic sense, peer aides have no official status, and their pay varies from one Housing First site to the next. In 2012, the first university diploma training program for peer aides was created in Paris, but did not continue until 2017, when it was resumed. It is clear that the value added of the peer aides are their lived experiences, but how that is measured and evaluated is still controversial. It is also a source of controversy among peer aides that the training program may interfere with their authenticity and become more pedagogical. Although more training programs are evolving to legitimize the profession, and the value of peer aides is undergoing a transformation with more and more job opportunities in the medico-social world, the profession is still undervalued and is still awaiting an official statute after all these years. One of the examples that I have is a tenant that I met in her home, and she was extremely ill. She was completely mute and answering in monosyllabic tones. And I asked her, "Are you going to make it through the weekend?" And she said, "I don't think so." And I said, "Well, do you want to be hospitalized? Because that really is our last resort." And she said, "Yes, I do." But I made sure I asked her permission to hospitalize her before engaging in the process with the team of getting her into a hospital. And when I met with the psychiatrist at the hospital, I was introduced as a peer aide, and he looked at me with a completely blank stare, like I was no one. And so I added, "I also am a psychiatric social worker from the US." And he wrote down on this little pad, "She is a psychiatric social worker in the United States." And that gave me some validity in his eyes to discuss her case and her symptoms so that she could get the help that she needed. At first, at Housing First, I was initially paid as a home aide, and then to raise my salary as I spent more years there, they found another slot I could fit into, because in France, everything has a slot that you fit into in terms of pay by your diploma, the amount of time, your master's, and what degree you have. At least it is stated in the ministerial decree that peer aides must be part of the multidisciplinary team, which is a nod in the right direction. But peer aides still have a long way to go to raise awareness of the value of lived experience and the help that it provides to tenants in Housing First. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That was really, really good. And thanks for sharing some of your own personal experience there. It can be very, very difficult. So we really do appreciate it, because it's stories that are shared like that that make these webinars work. So that's very, very good. I'm sure, and I can see questions coming in that we'll be able to ask at the end. So if that's okay, we'll hold them till then. Okay, next up we have Rika. And Rika is a peer support worker and a mentor at No Fixed Abode NGO in Finland. She is a trained peer worker and mentor currently. The No Fixed Abode NGO was originally founded by people with experience of homelessness, and they have been represented of late on the steering group of the recent national programme to reduce homelessness in Finland. The organisation has also implemented several Housing First projects in Finland, and Rika has some really good information in terms of peer work and how they are ingrained in her project. So I'm going to ask Rika now to unmute and share her screen for her presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Rika, and I'm peer worker in Novix Board NGO, and I'm also recovering addict. Have been clean almost 4 years. So I'm working in Novix Board NGO, and you already told it. It's founded by homeless themselves, 1986. I want to tell you a little bit how I get here. I'm training in this KO project. I have training. This training is take like a three months in school, and after that I have to go to working 4 months. Then I'm like, I'm ready.
Rika came to Novix the Boat a bit more than a year ago, and Rika was first at the KO project. That it's a project that was in the applied science schooling thing, and it was the educational education model for people who has alcohol or drug addiction.
Yeah, criminal
background, and it was the training that was giving some tools and some training for people who want to start to work as peer workers. And Rika is one of the first ones. I think you were on the second the second class there. The idea also for this KO project is that people are networking with the organizations and also with people who are working in this NGO field, but also like because of their own experience, they know what kind of services should be provided, and then also what people who are working with the social or health side, what are the things that they should be aware, and what are the needs that people have. So that is the basic idea of the training itself. And then also because how peer workers can be part of the Housing First model, and what are the strengths and the experience and ideas that they can bring to the Housing First idea. And the idea is that you don't make any services without hearing people who have their own experiences, because we can be very smart and very clever with the things that, oh yeah, these are the things that people who are experiencing homelessness should have. And then we make the models and we do all kind of things, but they don't actually meet with people who are in the situation. Or like people get their apartment, but they don't know how to keep it, even though they have the support for the living and being in their first or home or whatever. So that is the idea, that what kind of support people need. And Rika was doing some projects with the Novix the Boat, or visiting schools with our other peer workers, and then we figured out like she's a keeper, that we want to keep her. And then when we were able to offer her a position in our organization, so she became as a part of our staff.
Yeah, this is my first job ever. So it was so when I come here and working, I was thinking I have to show I know how to do it, and I forgot to take care of myself first. So I take like a 12 hours job a day, and I was almost burned out. But then my coworkers say, hey, you should slow down. You had already proof you know how to do it. And so that's chill. You don't have to do that much. Yeah.
And that is the idea, like, because our organization was established by people who have experienced homelessness, and we have still like at least 25% of our staff are people who are peer workers and who has experienced homelessness themselves. So we have very strong support for peer workers who are with us, because we know that very fast you will be exhausted, and then also like you have to share your experience very, very often. Then also like you see people who are in the situation where you have been before, and then there are people that you can't always help immediately. So that is also very tough for people. So we have like our team is supporting each other's.
Yeah.
People like our peer workers have their own team, and then us, the other staff also, like we are always there for each other's. And then also
Like now.
and then also we have the I'm not sure about the word, but it's like the työnohjaus. It's the professional supervising from outsiders, from the professionals, that we provide to our peer workers at least once a month.
Yeah, I get the two times a
times,
month.
yeah. So that is like at least once a month there is a professional out from outside the organization who is giving the supervision and support with work-related issues.
That is so important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that there's like where you can kind of go through the cases, get the second opinion from a professional who is outsider from the situation. And that is something that we always recommend for the other ones also who have peer workers and people who has experienced themselves. That they, I mean, like it's very, very important that
Yeah.
not only the staff of your own organization, but you get also the supervision and support from outside.
So what I do, helping and advise service workers. That is the good thing. And
That is like the peer workers, what are doing is like helping with people who are living in the supported houses, that it's how to cope with your everyday life and kind of how do you get the services, what you need, for example. And then also it's very important to remind people that you have rights. It is like you have rights to demand service. And that is also like our peer workers are walking through the services with people if they need the person to be on their side, because it can be very intimidating that you go to the offices and you go here and there and you have been treated sometimes very badly. You start to feel like you are invisible, you don't exist for the services, you don't exist for the society. So our peer workers are very strong with that one. Then also what Riikka and other peer workers from us do, that is this working pair model. They are participating in the processes how to make it work well. And it's not only here in Helsinki, but all around Finland and in different kind of the supporting housing places, day centers, whatever the places are. And then with the different kind of service providers, how to make the working pair model to work. That it's not only the tick that, okay, we have had the peer worker here and then we do the services as we want. But the idea that actually people who has experienced homelessness themselves, they will give their point of view to the services when they are developing those. Our peer workers are also participating on the high level of the governmental things, like when we are doing our housing on the governmental level. Also peer workers are heard that what are the things that we should do to decrease the number of homelessness here, and what are the right steps to take. For example, when we get the statistics, and that has been very, very helpful. Then of course, like the media work is important. Like we will try to take down the stigmas and the prejudging things and everything. So that is like sharing the stories, but we make sure that our peer workers are also not opening too much of their life, and not too much, like, because media, of course, loves to hear these stories, but then like, yeah, we make sure that, yeah, like,
You did read it before
yeah.
that thing published.
Yeah, and then also what we do, like I'm working in our communications, so I give training. How do you protect yourself in the interviews? Journalists are not your friends, but you don't have to be afraid of them either. So it's kind of like, what do we want to share is also important thing, and not overexposed either.
Yeah.
And then also Riikka is doing very much work with youth and
Yeah.
schools. That is her passion. And then also women who are experience homelessness. So she was a part of the NEA project. Yeah.
Our peer workers are a part of us, like a regular staff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Treated and served like any other worker in the organization.
That is so important. I look at the watch and it's like at 12:50, so maybe I should stop and waiting for questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Riikka. That was absolutely great. And your colleague, Erja?
Area? Yes.
Oh, very good. Thank you both for that. It's really, really difficult to present in a second language, and I really appreciate you taking time to do it. So that's really, really good. Just so you know, Riikka, the comments coming in full of support for your presentation is amazing. You can have a look yourself at the comment section. So thank you to all three panelists, and thanks for sharing your experiences and your different viewpoints. We do have a couple of questions that we're going to try and get through. And the first one for any of the panelists is, what is the expectation on peer workers to share their lived experience?
From our perspective, Niall, part of the reason we employ peer support workers is so that they can share some of their experience. So there is an expectation there, although there is a level to which, you know, they have to be comfortable within that. But that's how people know they have lived experience, is by the title peer. So therefore there is an expectation that they will use that lived experience and share it to a comfortable degree.
Is there any guidance from an organizational point of view, or is it just down to the person themselves, do you think, Liz?
The guidance will come in support and development and training that we have for peer workers as well. It is a very personal thing, so it tends to be done more on a one-to-one basis, you know, when there's support and development meetings. So,
and that's part of the learning and development of a peer worker as well, in terms of their own sense of self. Yeah. and what they share. Okay, yeah, very good. The next question is, what support or development is provided to peers to safeguard them when they do share their experiences? Because I think that question comes from, we know a lot of customers or a lot of clients who we talk to, they overshare their own personal information. And is that something to be wary of, or something that we need to take responsibility for safeguarding?
I think that, I mean, part of what we're hired for is to share our personal experience in order to create a bond and to help the tenant open up about his or her personal experiences. But there are boundaries that are important to keep and to safeguard oneself, because there's something that's called the mirror effect that can be quite difficult to experience. And that's when you begin to be impacted by the addictions of the tenant that you are working with and sharing your experience with. And most of that is addressed on the team level. You share with the team how you're experiencing a particular incident. One incident I was confronted with was, I knocked on the door of a tenant and he was shooting up. And the two people that were with me, one almost got sick and the other one just pulled away. And for me, it was a flashback into the days that I used to be doing that. And so I resorted to the only thing that I could think of, which was harm reduction, which was a tool that I had in my kit of what to do in a situation like that. I could talk to him about harm reduction, but pretty much about nothing else, and left pretty quickly because it was not a safe situation for me or for the other people that were with me.
And as a kind of follow-up question, it's kind of segued very, very nicely. We've got another question in terms of the importance placed on language. And for example, the question is, for example, a social service professional been trained to use substance misuse over abuse, or when referring to equipment, new rather than clean. So in terms of that knowledge and having, I suppose, having the correct words to use when engaging with tenants, how important is that?
I think it's very important. I mean, with the tenant in particular, I was asking him, are you using clean needles? Are you discarding your needles safely? Are you getting your things to cook the substance in from an association? Or are you getting them on the street? I mean, I just wanted to make sure that he was getting clean material and that he wasn't going to have some kind of secondary effects from his using. So I wanted to reassure myself of that and then let him go on doing what he was doing. And that was really the most that I could do because he was not really accessible at that particular time. So there is a vocabulary, yes, in harm reduction.
We are consistently reviewing the language that we use. That happens probably on a monthly basis. You know, we're always looking at if we can introduce a different word for something. I'll just share something that somebody said to me yesterday from the Salvation Army when they were talking about language, and it was, we do, especially in the pandemic, we do many things where we do well-being calls, well-being visits, well-being check-ins. If we weren't working with people who were using substances, with them we talk about harm reduction. If it was a friend or a colleague we were talking to, we would talk about well-being, not harm reduction. So is that something that I just threw that in there because I really thought it was good. So we always saying, well, let's use harm reduction techniques. Perhaps we should be saying something along the lines of, well, let's look at your well-being, which would, you know, that would be part of it. So your language is huge. Yeah.
So that reinforced the point that the use of language and how we address things is hugely important in maintaining a relationship, but also getting the best for our tenants, our clients, our Housing First clients. So at this point, Samara has been on, and we are looking at extending the presentation for 10 or 15 minutes, just because a lot of questions coming in, and we've had 3 really brilliant presentations that have given us a great insight into peer working and how we go about it. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to step out because I do have a training session to attend at 11 o'clock, and I wasn't expecting us to run over. So I want to thank Liz and Alison and Rika for their presentations. Really, really good. And I'm sorry I'm not getting to see the end of it. And I'm going to hand over to Samara. And to everybody who joined in, thank you very, very much. We will be hosting another webinar in April time, as far as I can remember, and I hope to see you all then. So thank you very, very much all.
Thank you, Niall, for hosting. That's been great, and moderating. I just thought, yeah, maybe we'll take another few minutes to address some of the questions if you guys are okay to stay for another few minutes, because there's been so many. And just to the people participating as well, we'll try and get to some of the answers. Quite a few questions have come in around the question around compensation. How are people paid compared to, you know, that difference between, you know, somebody as a trained social worker versus a peer worker. It might be interesting to have, you know, Alison mentioned it in her presentation as well. I think it remains an issue. So I don't know if there's something that you would like to comment on, and maybe some recommendations that people can take to their own countries or their own organizations.
I want to say something about this, how I paid in peer workers, because my salary is like same as everybody else. It's really good, and I like it because in here Finland, some places is using peer workers like volunteers like or €9 a day, and I don't like it because they come in with their stories, and you don't pay like $20. So
Yeah.
what is that? Yeah.
And that is like, in some places they approach the peer workers as that it's part of their maybe like rehabilitation or something, and then they are not getting paid equal like the other workers. But in our organization, it is like we all are equal on that sense. And I don't have an experience myself, but I mean, like, she and we have same rights, and we are as equal as possible in our organization. And that is throughout our whole organization. It has always been.
And because peer workers usually they have so much debt.
Yeah, like debts, like
Debts.
from the past. Yeah.
So it's so important to get paid. Well,
Liz, do you want to comment, and then, or maybe Alison, did you want to come in?
Yeah,
On that?
we don't have a formal education program for peer workers. So peer workers, when they come in, are generally unqualified workers, and it is about their lived experience. So they come in at the same level as a support practitioner. Now, as a support practitioner would be someone who it's perhaps their first job in social care. And in the UK and in Scotland, we have vocational qualifications that you gain on the job. So it's not a trainee, but it's about learning the skills that you need to be a support worker, to be a good support worker. Yeah, so it's at the same level as a support practitioner. It can be a lower salary than other more senior people on your team, but that's because they have the experience and the learning and everything else behind them. And the idea is that you will work your way up from the support level up to the lead level, and then so on and so forth, however high you want it to go.
Maybe just a quick question for clarification that just came in is, is there a difference, or what is the difference between a peer worker and a support worker?
Yeah, I saw that as well. So a peer worker and a support worker are both the same, apart from the peer worker has lived experience.
Okay.
As far as grade goes, though, they're the same. And the responsibilities for a peer worker will start off less, but they will become the same as a lead worker. And when they get to that, that's time for them to start looking to move on to something. A better salary with more responsibility, so.
Okay. Great. Alison, did you want to come in on that question as well?
I think in France, what the different sites try and do is sort of cobble together a way to remunerate the peer workers. If there's no unified salary for the peer workers across the sites, some sites remunerate them better than others. Different institutions where peer workers work remunerate them in different ways as well, because and even if they have a university diploma as a peer worker, there still isn't an official statute for a peer worker in France that defines what the salary would be. So it's really up to the managers and the oversight committee as to what a peer worker's salary is, despite their lived experience and the fact that they do much of the same work as most of the other members of the team. So it's very unequal in France, and lived experience and its value is still very undervalued in my eyes.
Maybe just a question about, for those organizations that don't have peer workers already, what would you recommend would be sort of a first step, or how would you get it started? And I think that's kind of come up through some of the questions.
I think one of the thoughts of peer workers is that they need to organize themselves as a group and either federate themselves or create a federation for peer workers so that they have some kind of status outside of the administrative kind of bureaucratic framework. And that's one of the projects of one of the peer workers in Housing First. And to, in a way, give ideas on how to value lived experiences and examples of how lived experiences help this population of people and really is a benefit to the team and to the project of Housing First and its values.
Liz, did you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, just I think we're slightly different here in Scotland, and that each organisation decides what they're going to pay whoever works for them. You know, it's not a general thing. And for anybody, for any team or organisation that doesn't have peer workers, I would suggest that you give it a try. And you know, you just bring them in at the same level as your lowest grade worker, if that's what you're doing. And as I say, it's almost like a trainee program.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing, yes, you pay them whatever that salary is. It's worth trying. You don't always need peer workers to succeed in Housing First. I mean, it's been shown that it can succeed either with or without, but it is beneficial to the team and to the service that you're able to provide. And service users absolutely appreciate the fact that you have peer workers on your team. They really do.
Rika, do you want to say something?
I want to say something. Yeah, I think those who doesn't have to be peer workers, they need the courage to do that, so they can learn so much. I know that.
I mean, there's one question that I don't think we can all answer here because, but it's a question about formal training. And I think there was a question, it was put in the chat, and I mean, from our own experience, maybe you can speak from your own experience. The question is, do you know what formal training exists in your own countries and beyond? And also, just maybe to what Liz has just said, it seems like there's an element of really learning on the job, that it's maybe something that people learn as they go. So are there some tools that maybe your organizations have that you can share in terms of how do you bring peer workers on? What kind of training do you provide? I don't know, maybe we start with Liz and go around again.
With regards to tools, it's probably something we're fairly short of, which is why I do most of the talking on it, because I'm the one with the experience. So I'm the tool in Turning Point Scotland.
And for us too.
And I think because we didn't realise how big it was going to be when we got into it, you know, and how relevant it was going to be to other countries as well. We have done a review over the past 18 months or so. And one of the questions was, should we have the word peer within the title? Should it just be a support worker? And after a year and a half of discussions and conversations with service users, with staff, peer staff, senior staff, at the end of that 18 months and all that time that was being put into it, the answer was yes, we keep it as peer support worker.
Okay.
So even though we spent all that time and put all those resources in, it's agreed that that is the best way for a service user to understand what the background their worker has, and you know, in their lived experience, and it's the best way for other people to understand, and also for the peer worker themselves. And there will come a time when they want to drop the title peer, but we absolutely support that, and that would happen after, you know, once they had learned a lot, and they might then not want that label as a peer. For some that's important, for some it's not, and we would just, that's fine, you know, you would just move on to something different.
Rika or Alison, do you have comments about training either ahead of time or on the job, or the sort of?
I think in France, you're hired for your your lived experience. And also what's important is your recovery and how much time has passed since your active days and your recovery and how stable you are, because it's a difficult job and you're confronted with many difficult situations.
Mhm.
And there is supervision, but it's for the whole team. It's not especially for peer workers, which you have. But there in France, there are also diploma program, university diploma programs in Paris, Lyon, and Grenoble that have just that have started up. And so they're training peer workers, but a lot of people are dissatisfied with those training programs or feel they get no support after the training program to
Right.
go on to work as peer workers. So those are still evolving as well. And
Okay.
and again, there's still no official statute for a peer
Mm.
worker despite the university diploma.
Right.
Although some jobs do require the university diploma to be hired as a peer worker.
Great, thank you. Rika?
Yeah, we have also in Finland like different kind of trainings for peer workers and lived by experience. Some of them are good and some of them are not very good.
Yeah.
Some of them are quite short for over the
weekend
weekend
or something.
and that kind of thing. But this training, KEO training or program where Riikka was is University of Applied Sciences that arrange them, and that is something that we have experienced or learned that it gives quite good tools to people who go through that training. Absolutely. Then also like Riikka's colleague, also a peer worker, he was actually starting and kind of like
He's like a father.
he's the
KEO
father
project.
of the whole project. So that
Okay.
was like from
Okay.
his experiences, he thought that there should be some kind of training for peer workers.
Who has the criminal background?
Yeah, he has criminal background and yeah, he has been doing lots of peer working with the people who are with prison workers. So yeah, that's our experience. There should be some kind of support and training for
Mhm.
each peer worker that exists in any organization. That's
Mhm.
tough job and it's
Yeah, and you have to be clean.
yeah.
So it's so important you don't use drugs anymore.
Yeah, and you support also with the recovery.
Yeah.
And that's very, very important. And as Alice said, that there should be long enough time
Mm.
and making sure that the recovery is in a good place on that sense. So
Yeah.
that's very, very important. But what you said there.
In Turning Point, we have a policy at the moment where you have to have a minimum of 2 years free from substance misuse
Mhm.
before you can apply.
Yeah.
We're also reviewing that at the moment because it also means that anybody who may be on ORT, methadone or whatever, they can't apply either.
Mm.
But we're looking at that and thinking, well, should they be able to apply? Because it's a medical prescription, substitute. We haven't made a decision on that yet, but it's in discussion and under review just now. So
Okay. Well, I think anyway, I think we should probably wrap up now as we've gone kind of past a little bit beyond, but I really appreciate that you took the time to stay on with us and answer these questions. And I think it really shows that this is an area that a lot of people are interested in and a lot of people want to do it and want to do it well. So I think building this network as we're doing here to be able to share experiences and share the tools that we have is really what we need to be able to do this well and to keep doing more of it in different countries and in different Housing First programs. So thank you very much for sharing your experience. We will be putting everything from this webinar onto our website. So you'll be able to watch the webinar again or direct somebody who hasn't seen it to go and watch it. We'll also put the presentations onto the website as well, so people can go back and look at those. And I would invite anybody who is listening who happens to have some tools around peer work that if you'd like to share them with us so that we can distribute them, please send them, drop an email to myself or to Claire to let us know if you've got something and pass it along. We'd be really happy to sort of gather some of those tools around peer support. That would be great. So I'll just formally thank again Alison, Enrica, and Liz for the presentations today, and to Claire, our behind the scenes but very, very effective technical assistant and coordinator of all these webinars. So thank you, Claire. And thank you to everybody who joined us this morning. It's been really interesting and great to see so many people tuning in. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, we'll be back in April with the next one. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.